Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, May 18th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, in Congress, a tied vote, a stalled reconciliation package, and big questions about how laws actually get finished. Plus, agency reorganization plans can look clean on paper, but turn out far messier in real life. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Last year, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth directed the military services to reduce the number of permanent change of station moves by 50%. The Air Force, in partnership with RAND, then took a closer look at how longer assignments and fewer moves would impact budgets, readiness, retention, and the career development of airmen. To understand more about RAND's findings, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Lisa Harrington, senior operations researcher, and Kelly Atkinson, political scientist, both from RAND.
At a high level, we found that there are cost savings opportunities the Air Force can pursue, and we found that some of the most effective changes that make in order to generate the largest amount of cost savings for annual budgets would be to lengthen overseas assignments by a certain amount and lengthen stateside assignments when able. And that means tours that are not controlled tours, so tours that are not a set amount of time based on the mission being accomplished. Those could stay the same, but all other tours could be lengthened stateside in order to reduce the number of moves. We also found that if you change the length of assignments, it will have impacts on existing models for career development and expectations for what military members need to do to be competitive for promotion. And so what we recommended is that if you do end up changing the assignment length, the Air Force will need to adjust career development expectations and communicate those to the force in order to ensure that the relationship between assignments and career development moves in parallel with these changes.
So some of the other ways we looked at the problem that could address this. So we looked, for example, at opportunities for leaving people in the same general vicinity, but yet being able to take on jobs that have increasing responsibility. So there could be opportunities at certain locations, and definitely for certain AFSCs, there are these kinds of hubs where people can have multiple jobs at different levels, but that don't require a PCS, don't require an assignment move. So that was one of the things we explored to see how much that could happen over and above the way it has happened historically, and what sort of things would that drive. The other thing that we looked at also had to do with the extent to which the Air Force is currently following policies that limit the movement of people. So in some cases, there might be a policy that says, if you go to this kind of an assignment, you're required to stay for a certain amount of time. We find that over history, if we look at historically, there are often times when people are released from those kinds of jobs and not held to that assignment duration for other very good mission-related reasons. But to the extent that the Air Force can continue to follow its own policies, there's an opportunity to reduce the number of PCSs there as well.
I'll add a bit more to that. So clarifying what I said earlier about extending overseas tours and enforcing longer tours stateside, specifically, we find that extending certain overseas tours could generate $186 million in annual savings from the Air Force's PCS budget, and enforcing a 5-year tour length for many assignments in the continental United States could generate $240 million in annual savings. And these are savings from the operational and rotational budgets for permanent change of station moves that the Air Force follows on an annual basis. We also found that frequency for moves and preference for how often personnel move is not the same throughout the force. So there are some people who want to move more frequently, and there are some people who want more stability and they want longer assignments. So the Air Force, what we found is that the Air Force can capitalize on the variation that exists at present in the population of service members. They can think about preferences that service members have for how often they want to move, and they can adjust policy to maximize some of those preferences. So if we analyzed exit survey data, and we found that junior enlisted tend to leave the service and cite that they're moving too infrequently. They want to move more. And so they're leaving the service because they wanted to join to see the world, but they're not moving enough. Whereas officers, specifically FGOs, they leave because they're moving too much. And so when they're completing an exit survey, they're indicating too many PCS moves as a reason to justify and explain why they're leaving. So what we find is that there are population differences that exist within enlisted and officer, or even across career fields. And the Air Force can do a better job understanding those differing desires for move frequency. And then they could find ways to allow service members to have more agency in choosing to move frequently, or saying, no, I want to stay, and I understand that could impact my career development accordingly.
You also had this stakeholder workshop to kind of better understand the assignment system and explore policy options for extending assignment durations, while also balancing costs and readiness and retention. What were some of the major findings there, and maybe points of consensus in that discussion?
So I'll start, Kelly. I really think that it's very interesting how difficult it can be to get people out of the current mindset for how assignments are made and the impacts those have on a career and how a career looks. Really, the amount of moves that an officer, for example, might make on their pathway to becoming a general officer or even a colonel and being promotable along the way, that's really cultural. That's really internal to the Air Force. There's not hard evidence that they lean on to say that you must make that many moves because then you're going to learn the things you need to learn for your, to be a qualified officer at that rank. Rather, it's more about looking at the record and seeing how many jobs they've had and that kind of a thing as the goal. So it is very interesting. And one of the things that we did talk about quite a bit in the project, how people really see things through the lens of what they experience themselves and what they know to be a pathway for a career.
I definitely agree with Lisa. I think specifically in the workshop, what we heard is that, no, you have to move for development. And people kept saying that throughout the workshop and also throughout this project when we interviewed people. Well, you have to move for development. So if you make assignments longer, that will disrupt that reality, that rule that you must move for development. And in the project, we took the perspective that the process of moving and the system of career development are not causing each other. That if you change one, in this instance, if you start with changing the length of assignment, that's your baseline. And then afterwards, you'll just have to adjust career development models and communicate that to the force. It's not an impossible problem. You simply have to decide we're changing one aspect. And as a result, career development will have to change. So in the workshop, we did try to encourage participants to disrupt that mindset of you must move for development and say, not necessarily. If you stayed in place longer, what would have to change with career development expectations? And they did reflect that you would need to change those guidelines for promotion, guidelines for when people are meeting boards, when people are going to school. But again, they reflected that would be difficult to do. And I think consensus was also that you could adjust some things in a small way, but there was pessimism about whether you could change the whole system in a big enough way. So I think the workshop showed us that the cultural expectation for moving associated with positive career development is deeply entrenched within the force.
The other expectation that we tried to have good discussion on has to do also with the idea that there should just generally be this one-size-fits-all process by which you decide whether to move people. So does it make sense that for officers, for example, that all AFSCs and all career fields are moving at the same pace? That they're, that generally the schedule for moving is relatively the same. Perhaps not. I mean, there could be aspects of functions that make it more beneficial for people to stay in one place longer, longer to learn the job. And once they do, it's good to leave them there. There's operational reasons why it might be good to move people more often or less often. But so that idea of placing just a single process over top of the entire, both officer and enlisted force, independent of the AFSC, that's, we tried to see if we couldn't get participants to think through that as well and think about treating AFSCs differently as well.
Given all that, what would then implementation look like? What are some of the considerations there?
What we found and what we outline in our policy recommendations is that if the Air Force wants to generate significant cost savings by changing assignment policy, they will need to make overarching large-scale changes. Small adjustments will not yield enduring cost savings results. I think with that in mind, we recommend that the Air Force decide what level of change it wants to make. And that could be in order to meet DOW directives for cost savings, or it could be to make a systemic change for the service itself, because that's where the Air Force wants to go. But implementation will be challenging because of the constraints that we've talked about. People have a certain expectation for what their career will look like. People have an expectation for what their PCS cycle will look like and how that will connect to career development. So for implementation, once the Air Force decides what cost savings it wants to achieve and what model it wants to adopt, we outline where they can make those changes for CONUS assignments, for OCONUS assignments. We model different excursions for changes they can make in those assignment cycles. So we sort of provide a menu for how they can achieve some of those cost savings. I recommend that if they do pursue changes, clear strategic communication to the field is necessary, because you want to make sure everyone understands the reason for these changes and how they will impact their career development progression.
That's RAND's Kelly Atkinson, political scientist, and Lisa Harrington, senior operations researcher, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, in Congress, a tied vote, a stalled reconciliation package, and big questions about how laws actually get finished. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.